Before going into looking at how you will encounter land in humanitarian assistance in transitional or conflict-affected environments, I want to say a few words on the history of international engagement with land and property. There certainly has been a historical reluctance to engage with land issues. It's due to a number of different factors, perceived or real complexity, political sensitivity, but often also a lack of awareness, and I'll come back to that when I talk about indirect engagement. I said it at the outset of the course, of the session. The fact that USAID is organizing the course is in itself indicative of how the past few years have seen an upsurge of interest within the international community on dealing with land issues in transitional environments. There really is this realization that if we want to do peace building, if we want to do peacemaking successfully, we have to look at land in most contexts as well. Programming is increasing, but I think it is fair to say that land remains a sector where gaps in international responses and awareness remain acute. If you look at how much funding is going to land, it still remains an area that I think broadly for all donors remains underfunded, and there are still donors that are not particularly keen in engaging with the land issues. I think that overall increased international engagement has been a positive thing, although now I'm starting to worry that there's been too much of a silo approach in dealing with land issues from the international community, where people are trying to apply multiple frameworks that are colliding without necessarily much exchange. I already said from the outset, land sometimes is dealt with by humanitarian assistance actors. Sometimes it's dealt with in the context of peace building. Sometimes it's dealt with in the context of conflict prevention and social cohesion programming. Sometimes it's dealt with transitional justice and human rights programming. And sometimes it's dealt with in the context of economic development and economic activity. Now, very often all these different areas are operating together without much intersection. And given my own organization's large humanitarian portfolio, I've been surprised to go to countries like Haiti, like Cote d'Ivoire, where there's been a long history of economic development assistance, where you come into meetings, in cluster meetings as we call it, which are coordination meetings on land, and where people will say, well, you know, we don't know what to do because nobody knows what the land situation is here, or nobody seems to have the technical expertise to move forward. When you know that on the other hand, there's been actors like the World Bank that have been engaging on land issues for 20 or 30 years, and there isn't this dialogue, and there's a tendency for each of those communities, if you like, that I mentioned, to come in and say, we are the new people, and we now have to find out and design our own frameworks on how to deal with land issues. So I think this silo approach is definitely something that we should all advocate for to be abolished and to be broken down, if you like. Direct engagement is one thing, but of course there's been a lot of indirect engagement with land issues by the international community, and many international assistance activities, humanitarian or otherwise, may have profound impact on local land relations. Often the mere presence of large number of internationals has impact on local land relations. When after the independence in Dili, of the capital of East Timor, you have the influx of thousands of internationals. That, of course, impacts profoundly how land relations function, how poor people have access to housing, for example, in a small city like Dili, for example. I think there has been, and there still is, a lack of awareness and a phenomenon of shifting responsibilities for medium and longer term impact elsewhere. I'll give the example of the humanitarian demining sector. When you demine, when you go to a village in Afghanistan and there are 50 plots of land and you have money to demine 20 of those, the selection of the 20 out of the 50 is going to be an enormous impact upon social cohesion. It's going to have enormous impact upon land relations, because the 20 plots will all of a sudden become the very valuable plots, while the 50 plots, or the 30 remaining plots rather, sorry, that have not been demined will remain without any value whatsoever. In the past, when you would speak to these demining actors, they would say, well, yeah, sure, that's an interesting issue, but I'm here to technically take out these mines and to make sure that when people go to these plots that I'm dealing with, that they can go there safely and that they can use them for agriculture, and that's the end of my responsibility. Over the years, the sector has realized that very often these very humanitarian action created more problems down the line for local populations, with poor people losing the land as soon as it was being demined, violence occurring around demined land, and have now made an effort to raise awareness amongst humanitarian demining actors that they also need to look at land. Doesn't mean that they need to become land experts, but it does mean that they need to look at the impact on land, and that they need to refer maybe to other actors to assist them if land conflicts would break out. And I think the do no harm principle in all these areas that I mentioned, and self-interested pragmatism, i.e. wanting to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves when we provide international assistance, no matter what the area is, require that land-related impacts are taken seriously, also by actors that are not necessarily directly dealing with land. And I think that at the global level, there is an increased awareness amongst humanitarian actors specifically. And I'll come back to that example. There's different organizations that are mainstreaming land as a compulsory training component for their staff. Looking at my own organization, looking at the Norwegian Refugee Council, we're both working at looking at how can we mainstream land in the professional training that our humanitarian staff needs to do. Not again to turn them into land experts, but to make sure that they understand that whatever it is that they do in camp management, whatever it is that they do in terms of shelter constructions, that there are land components. There's more and more tools that are specifically developed for humanitarian actors looking at land, for example. And I'll give an example later when I speak about how you will encounter land in humanitarian assistance from the Global Shelter Cluster, which is the global coordinating mechanism for all the actors that are dealing with shelter. We have started to, as IOM, to routinely include land and property relation information in all the data collection that we do on displaced population in conflict and natural disasters situations. It's something that 5 years ago, when I discussed this in my own organization, people would look at me and say, well, it's just one of the many things that we could do, but that we're not going to do. Now there is an increased awareness that if you're going out there and you're going to collect information about where displaced people are, about what it is that they need, that one of their fundamental needs have to do with land, and you have to include that, not just to know what you have to do in terms of assistance in the short term, but also what you have to plan for durable solutions when you move forward into the transitional environment. What are some of the initial lessons learned, if you like, lessons learned rather by the international community of dealing with land in conflict? First, I think, and that is really an unfortunate element, because it's reinforced by what happens at the national level, that the intersectorial nature of land, the fact that it applies, or that you see it appearing in so many different sectors, actually poses an enormous coordination challenge at the international level, which needs to be tackled somehow. You have so many actors that are encountering little pieces of land here and there, or little pieces of their work have to do with land rather, and it's very difficult to get some sort of coordinated action going, especially because it's intersectorial, or cross sectors rather. The unfortunate part of that is that when you look at national situations, and you look, for example, you make a list in a country like Iraq, for example, how many entities in the government deal with some aspect of land management, you will also come up with a list maybe of 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 institutions. So this issue of cross-sectoral at the international level is compounded by cross-sectoral at the national level, and that makes it very difficult to get any coherent action going. Land needs to be integrated in conflict analysis. When you're doing conflict analysis in transitional environments, you need to have land as one of your components that you are looking at, and you have to understand the connections between the two to have a complete conflict analysis. And land interventions need to integrate conflict impact assessments. When you start doing a formal land titling program, it is not just about technically how can it be done. It's not just about the database. It's not just about the surveyors. It's not just about how are we going to logistically organize the outreach to the population. It's also about what is the conflict impact likely to be of these land titling programs, for example. And that doesn't only apply to land titling programs, it applies to anything that you're going to do. If you're going to support a large-scale land restitution program, which would be perfectly justifiable from a narrow individual rights perspective, there needs to be a conflict impact analysis. What does that mean to do in a context like Colombia, for example? What does it mean to do a large-scale land restitution program in terms of their impact on conflict or conflict prevention at the community level, for example? The third element, which I think is really important to stress, is that the local context is central, and practicability needs to be a central concern. Far too often, there are grant schemes that are being developed on land, whether it's titling, whether it's large-scale land restitution programs, that with a little bit of planning and a little bit of forethought, you would have realized that actually these can never be implemented. They're beautiful programs in and by themselves, but they're not practical in the context. And there's often a huge tension in transitional environments between what should really be done and what can be done. And it's very important, I think, for us as international actors, if we come in one way or another, whether it's as advisors or whether it's as funders, that we are the ones who focus on what can actually be done rather than on dreams of what should be done that are unrealistic and often, of course, result in, for the beneficiaries of our actions, in nothing happening at all. One context, for example, is Yemen, where a land commission was established to deal with the real land grievances in the south. Land commission is established and receives 6 judges, 20 staff. International community comes in and starts providing support to this commission, looking at providing databases, looking at providing guidelines, but never actually telling the truth, which is that 120,000 claims, 6 judges and 20 staff will never be resolved unless you increase massively the size of the commission. This issue of practicability, moving into supporting your commission with providing a database before you have the basics right, I think it's something that we need to be very, very careful about. Local context is central. Especially with land, blueprints very rarely work. And increasingly, and that's of course the downside, when the international community starts engaging with land, you start seeing programs that worked quite well in one country, people arrive in a country, transitional environment, there is money available, apply the program to another country. With land, as I'm sure is the case in many other areas, this rarely works. So this issue of local context as the central element in our concern should really be there with land. As a fourth point, I think it's very important to emphasize that with land, and I'm quite certain also in many other areas, but the focus on for us here is land, technical support isolated from political engagement may not work. It is impossible to think that if a government, as happened in Yemen, hands over one of the most sensitive files in the country to a land commission, that only providing technical support to this commission without making sure that all along the work of the commission, the international community is side by side to also provide political support to the commission, that this could ever work. And in many sensitive land-related issues in transitional environments, it is the same thing. Mere technical assistance doesn't work. It needs to be go alongside with political engagement that continues throughout the process. And finally, of course, it's very important, and maybe I should say that at the end of the session, but I'll say it now already, ignoring land issues that have the potential to undermine peace building or reignite conflict is rarely a good idea, despite the fact that there are many complexities in engaging. So one area where you will encounter lands and where you need to be aware of land issues is in the context of humanitarian assistance that is being provided in transitional context. And I think some of what I'm going to say applies not just to environments that are coming out of conflict, but also environments that come out of natural disasters, especially in countries that are relatively fragile in terms of state structures or that have gone through a lot of social unrest leading up to the disaster, for example. Sometimes these contexts are not so easily distinguishable. And I want to talk about one example of trying to assist humanitarian actors with dealing with land issues without themselves becoming a land expert. And it's in one area where I think often you see a lot of land conflicts arising, especially in these transitional environments, which is in shelter construction. When there's been large-scale displacement, when there's been large-scale destruction, be it through conflict, be it through natural disaster, shelter needs to be constructed. Very often in countries that have gone through these type of situations, it will not be so easy to identify who has right to what piece of land. There will not be documents. Maybe they were destroyed in the conflict. Land registry departments are often one of the first government buildings that get burned down in conflicts. Maybe the land records are faulty. When I was working in the Bangsamoro area in the Philippines, in some of the communities, people claimed that up to 85% of all land records that were available had been obtained through fraud or corruption. So when you start doing your shelter program, the fact that someone is waving a document at you at that point is not particularly relevant, or is certainly not necessarily proof that this person is the legitimate, as opposed to maybe at the service level, the formal legal title holder of the piece of land. So how can you assist humanitarian actors dealing with that? And I think there's been a tendency in the past to shower these people with what I would say normative guidelines, saying these are the human rights of the different people involved. IDPs have right to this, IDPs have right to that, IDPs have right to that. You need to be careful that these rights are respected. You need to be careful that this is respected, which of course is very important and needs to be done. But it doesn't necessarily tell you or doesn't necessarily help you when you are confronted with the fact that you have a budget to build 10,000 shelters. There seem to be 10,000 households out there that need shelter, but you don't know what land belongs to who, or you don't know whether the things that people are telling you, whether these 10,000 families are right in saying that the land they're living on is theirs. You don't know whether the communities that are saying that no, the land belongs to someone else is right. It doesn't help you to have a normative list of human rights next to you to decide what to do. So, at the request of the Global Shelter Cluster, which is the global mechanism to coordinate all the shelter activity that goes on in the world, if you like, IOM took the initiative to establish guidelines aimed at assisting shelter actors regarding land issues. And as opposed to simply just having land experts or human rights advocates or human rights experts sitting together and write a document, we actually created a group of people who were shelter practitioners and say, okay, what is it possible for you to do and what is not possible for you to do? And we came up with this land rights and shelter construction, the due diligence standard. And in a way, if I may, actually it is simply describing a due diligence standard that would in the private sector be absolutely normal to use if you're a construction company, for example. It's in essence saying to people, listen, if you're going to build some shelter somewhere, if you're going to build a house somewhere, there's a couple of steps that you need to go through as a company. You know, to find out whether the person that you're building it for is the rightful owner or rights holder, whether there is no government claims over the land, whether there are a number of normal steps that you need to do. And it's not because you're working in a transitional environment that you don't need to do those steps. They may be more complicated to do, but they are feasible and you need to do them. The idea is not, again, to turn shelter actors into land experts, but to ensure that they take an active interest in the rights enshrined on or existing on the land that they intend to build their shelter on. Why do they need to do that? It's important for what? Protection of shelter beneficiaries. If you build shelter on land that doesn't belong and you give that shelter to beneficiaries and that land does not belong to those beneficiaries, it will not take very long for these people to be evicted from those shelters after you've left. And that means that the idea, i.e. to give people a roof over their head, has failed and you could have prevented it from the outset. Secondly, it's reducing the risk of tensions and conflicts around the land. And that's particularly important in environments that are already fragile and where there's already a lot of tension when you come out of conflict. Respect for the do no harm principle. If you build land on shelter that belongs to someone else, clearly you are affecting harm to those persons who may have competing claims. This is particularly important in countries where you've had a lot of displacement. When in Western Côte d'Ivoire, people tell you that this piece of land is mine. How do you know if you know that 50% of the village is still in Liberia? There is no way for you as an international actor of knowing just by this simple declaration or even by talking to the local authorities that actually it isn't the case that some of the land belongs to 50% of those people that are still away. And of course there is a need for donor accountability and the need for legal certainty up to a point. I would like to pause 2 seconds here, and I don't have much time to go into it, to this concept of legal certainty. When we were doing work in Haiti, I was often asked the question when there was an agreement between an owner and a beneficiary for a rental agreement. Yes, that's great, but what is the legal validity of this document? How enforceable is this document? And I think what we have to, and it's very difficult to do for us, we have to move away from this idea that there is a rule of law environment necessarily in those countries that we are working on. Documents, you can draft them beautifully. You can have notary publics put 500 stamps upon them. But in the context of Haiti, for example, if a person does not respect an agreement and there is a very strong power imbalance, what exactly will happen? Is there a court system that can back up this weaker person to do so? No, it will have to be international actors or national government actors that will intervene to do mediation to try to remediate. So this concept of legal certainty shouldn't be looked at absolute and should certainly not be looked upon from the perspective, from a US perspective, or from the idea that there is an overall rule of law environment, because very often there is none. And it's very difficult for us to think outside that box of there is this whole mechanism out there, there is this whole institutional setup out there that will enforce agreements that we have. And of course, another reason why this due diligence standard is important is the ability to implement shelters projects timely and efficiently. When IOM in Haiti established a legal team to work alongside the shelter actors to construct shelters, the number of disputes that we had around shelter construction went down with 95%, which meant that we could increase the number of shelters we built. We didn't lose time with land disputes. We didn't lose time in the shelter construction. It allows for a more efficient use and, of course, a much more rapid delivery to beneficiaries of shelter. What is this due diligence standard that is foreseen? And the document is in your reading list, and I would highly encourage you to read the document, to go through it, because I think it might also be applicable in other areas. The due diligence standard is simply the need for shelter actors to establish a systematic process of research and analysis to avoid harm to other persons or violations of land rights that anticipates and responds to issues related to land rights. The establishment of such a process must ensure at 3 different stages of the shelter construction. Before the construction, legal certainty. Shelters actors obtain enough information about what the land rights actually are. Is there a lot of frequency of land disputes in the area that you're working on? Who has what right over what pieces of land? Who are the people that hold information? Very often, is it very difficult to get that information? Sometimes it's not easy, but very often you'll have national staff that will be able to help you with that. During construction, the capacity to react and respond. If something happens, do you have, as a shelter actor, the means, when you're constructing shelter and all of a sudden a group of people arrives at your doorstep or at the doorstep of the beneficiary and says, by the way, you have 24 hours to leave this land because this is my land and these people have guns. Do you have any capacity to respond? Have you foreseen this? Do you have procedures in place? Do you know actors that can help you to assist in this sort of environment? Again, very important in transitional environments where tensions are often relatively high and where, for example, the proliferation of arms in many of these countries is actually relatively high, and where this type of little disputes can very rapidly get out of hand. After construction, that's maybe the most difficult part, effective protection. When an actor leaves, when you are working in a very sensitive environment, when you're working in the Bangsamoro area and you have given shelter to IDPs, you have the agreement of the owners. You go after the shelter construction. What happens then? Have you handed over the fact that you've done this shelter program to the local government? Have you handed it over to human rights NGOs working in the area that can maybe go from time to time to monitor? Have the shelter beneficiaries been given some sort of information if there is someone who comes now and says you have to go because these shelters are actually quite nice and we want to take it over? These are the numbers that you can call. These are the people you can go to. Is that something that has been looked at all? Or have you just stopped at saying my shelters are constructors, the pictures have taken, I move away? It's one example, and I understand that you are not shelter actors necessarily, but it's one example of a technical area that has, in a way, inherently the focus is on the construction of shelter, but where land really needs to be looked at as an integral part of the process.